There are two big threads that underline everything that I do. The first one is deglobalization. The United States changed the way the world worked at the end of World War II. Instead of an imperial trading network that was everybody maintained their own system, we used our Navy to patrol the global oceans so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and access any commodity or market and trade with any partner. That had never happened before, but there was a catch. We did this if you allowed us to write your security policies in order to better fight the Soviets. It was a guns for butter trade. We are now 75 years on from that. Cold War ended 30 years ago, and the Americans have lost interest. And so we've been drifting into ever more strategic ambiguity ever since. And then the second big piece is depopulation. Normally, you have more teens than 20-somethings than 30-somethings than 40-somethings and on. But when the world started to globalize, people didn't have to be on the farm. They could move into town and take manufacturing or service jobs. And they did this on a global scale. And when you live on a farm, kids are free labor. But when you move into town, they are very, very expensive pieces of mobile furniture. Well, adults aren't stupid, so they had fewer kids. Everyone had fewer kids. And 75 years on, the baby bust has now been so long ago and so entrenched that most of the world's major economies are past the point of no return with their demographics. You put these two things together, and the idea that you can have a global interconnected system that has a balance between young workers and consumers and older workers and their investments, that's just gone. It's not possible anymore. And so we're heading to a fundamentally new age that breaks everything that we understand of how trade and economics and agriculture and manufacturing and transport and the rest works. Well, Davos is always a lagging indicator. By the time they get to the point that they're chatting about it at Davos, it's already past the point of no return. And we passed that point of no return probably around 2012. And in the case of some countries, even earlier. It's just that now we're feeling the effects of it. And part of that's demographic. When you have a drop in your birth rate, it takes time to play through the system, because if your birth rate halves in 1 year, you don't have the reduction in 30-year-olds for 30 years. So most countries in the advanced world passed the point of no return in roughly the 90s, and the Chinese in the early 2000s. And we are now to the point that we are noticing that we are running out of young workers. When you run out of children, no one really pays attention because they're not part of the economy in the normal sense. But when you start having labor shortages among people in their 20s and 30s, that changes the math. And in some of the advanced world, it's now to the point that they're literally running out of 40-somethings. So Davos is noticing something finally that has been coming since the 60s. But we are now at the point that we're not just at a point of no return. That was decades ago. We're now at the point where we're feeling the real and very immediate effects of a consumption class that is just gone. It depends on where you are. Every country has their own demographic structure. Every country started the industrialization and urbanization process at a different time and moved at a different pace. Part of that is because when the Industrial Revolution first happened, it was just in one country, Britain, and then eventually it came to the United States, and eventually it went to other places. The countries that started it later were able to follow the path laid down from those who came before. So with the Brits, it started with sewing spindles. We then moved into steam power, it moved into railways, and it took 7 generations for them to complete the entire process because they were the first ones doing it. The United States was a little faster. It took us only about 5. The Chinese have done it in 1. The more you compress the time frame, the greater the growth you get, because it's not just economic activity from the consumption of goods. It's building out the physical infrastructure that you need to support the new technologies. That's roads, that's skyscrapers, that's rail lines, that's steamships, that's diesel ships. When the Chinese did that in 1 generation, they got 7 generations of economic activity squished into 1. So of course they experienced breakneck, record-breaking growth. But it also means they condensed 7 generations of economic activity into 1 demographic generation. And they went from living in pre-industrial subsistence farms to high-rise condos in less than 40 years. So their birth rate went from 5 or to 7 children per woman to less than 1 in a single generation. So we're watching China now going from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in a single human lifetime. As for the geopolitical issue, it really depends upon where you are. If you are bordering a country that is central to your economic activity and they collapse, or that they're very aggressive and they branch out, you're going to face some very serious issues. So anyone who's dependent on Chinese trade on one side or who's in the Russian borderlands on the other has a very tough fight on their hands just to maintain their systems in their current forms. But if you're on a continent that faces no real security threats, and that continent is self-sufficient or even an exporter of food and energy, say South America, deglobalization isn't going to be nearly as rough. In fact, as competing producers of foodstuffs and energy fall offline, you might actually experience a boom. So the story is different everywhere for different reasons. Roughly from 1980 to 2015, we were in the perfect moment. The Cold War was winding down and then it was over. So the security situation of the world was great. The United States was still patrolling the oceans. We didn't have to worry about any commercial shipping getting attacked, except for a few pirates off of Malacca or East Africa. And that was a minor issue. At the same time, because different countries started their demographic decline at different points, we had a balance between countries that had a lot of folks in their 40s and 50s who were very industrious and productive, and a lot of countries that were in their 20s and 30s that had the lower cost labor, but were consuming all kinds of stuff. So we had a good balance between investment and consumption and production and trade in a manner that had never existed in human history before. Our mistake wasn't living in that moment. Our mistake was thinking that that moment was permanent when it was very temporary, because the foundations of that demographically and geopolitically are now gone. We're now aging into a period where we won't have the same levels of exchange. We cannot possibly have the same levels of consumption. And production is going to get broken up. So the economies of scale of the global whole are going away. Now, there are parts of the world that are in a good geographic position to profit from this. These are the countries that did really well before the global order. I'm talking about France. I'm talking about Japan. I'm talking about Turkey. I'm talking about the United States. But if you're a country that was dependent upon that peaceful interaction and that large volumes of investment or large volumes of consumption that were somewhere else, you now have to figure out a fundamentally new way to operate. We don't have an economic theory or model for how this might work, because everything since 1500 and the start of deep water navigation in the Columbus era has been based on the concept that the population is going to increase. And so there's going to be more interaction and more interconnectivity and more consumption, just bigger and more. We're now dealing with less. We don't know how to play that game. Now, for the United States, we have a continent that is safe, where we had the best parts of it. We have the healthiest demography in the advanced world, and Mexico has the healthiest demography in the advanced developing world. This is great. We're going to have, in the worst case scenario, at least another 35 to 40 years before we are in a situation like Germany or Korea or China today. We're going to be able to watch what happens to them, and hopefully we'll pick out a few lessons. There's a lot of countries who have tried that. The problem is, once you've urbanized, the cost of raising kids is extreme, and the sort of benefits that you have to offer have to be huge. A couple of examples. The Russians had the worst demography in the world until the Chinese passed them by about 15 years ago. Now they're only the second worst. And they tried back in the 2000s, when Putin really realized how bad the demographic picture was going to be. They offered cash prizes basically to every woman who would have a second or a third or fourth child. And so what happened is the women would have those child, they'd get their check, and they'd drop the kid off at the orphanage. And so there are now about 1.5 million to 2 million either street children or orphans in the Russian system.